That's correct.
And how much does that stop-loss coverage cost us?
Off the top of my head, I don't recollect. I know you had a health insurance consultant review all those bids recently. I believe they had that type of information.
Right now, Mr. Ferrucci, I'm asking you.
I don't have that information off the top of my head, sir. I'm sorry.
Also, this stop-loss coverage, this is to protect the plan for catastrophic illnesses, losses, et cetera, right?
To a certain level, yes. It's a stop-loss program.
Okay.
So the districts are vulnerable for the first portion of it. Once it reaches that plateau, then it goes into the stop-loss pool in which you're referring to. If it exceeds the $1 million of that pool, then it goes into a second pool. And if it exceeds that one, the claims do come back to the municipality or the school department. And I'm aware of at least two claims. Don't know who the people are. It doesn't matter to me. But they have gone through both cycles of stop loss, and those claims have come back to us. So there is protection, but it's not 100%.
So in addition to the stop-loss coverage that we have, you also include in your budget your own projection for technically another stop-loss coverage. Is that correct? You put monies in the budget to cover something beyond what the stop-loss coverage pays for. I think that's what you just said.
We get a premium value from WB Health. It's a fixed premium, and those are the funds that we pay on, whether it's a family plan or an individual. The amount of stop-loss used in any given year is not impacted within the course of the year that we start the premium at. So their calculation of what next year's premium is predicated on these underlying factors that you're referring to.
Thank you.
Mr. Ferrucci, I think you're projecting a 21% increase for next year in healthcare, correct?
Yes, I believe that to be true.
When's the last time you folks experienced a 21% increase in healthcare, based on your estimates?
Here in the city of Warwick, this is the first time I've ever had this level of need.
And that's based on your estimates?
This is based on what the projected premiums were going to be from WB Health at the time. And they have come home because the bid does support these numbers.
Thank you.
The next item is...
Councilman Corley had a question, sorry.
Mr. Ferrucci, I have a couple of questions about the out-of-district tuition.
I haven't gotten down there yet, Mr. Corley. If you want to just hold that, please.
So I think, and I apologize because we had interrupted Mr. Ferrucci on issues that he was talking about just so we could get numbers. I think for the way that this is going to flow, it might be easier to reserve questions on what Mr. Ferrucci's talking about, and then at the end, if there are some overall concepts that council members want to ask. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to get through his presentation, if that's all right with Mr. Corley, if we could reserve that question.
I thought he had brought up the fact that the out-of-district tuition had gone up by 1.5 million, and that was one of the problems. I may be mistaken.
Is that what you brought up, Mr. Ferrucci?
I was doing that as an introduction to understand the
Okay.
kind of data.
So you'll get to...
I will get to that specific
Thank
point.
you.
If we could hold it to that
I
point.
can wait. I can wait.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Retiree medical was after the medical. Our budget is $695. Our projection is $550, so there's a savings. Teacher pension, $10.5 million. We did not publicly acknowledge what the potential increase would be for this. That's why there's no gray bars on this, but it does have an impact. To the right-hand column, based on the salary increases and the increase in the state rate, we're at $11.26 million. I broke it down to show that the $677,000 is the increase overall. Of that, our state rate went up 4.9%, and that there's step increases associated with the 3% raises on teachers. So between those numbers and then some cost savings, it kind of nets itself out. Private pension, which is next, we had a budget of $1.8 million for this year. Under the new proposal, the school committee is $1 million. Thereby, it's reducing the pension by $799 for next year. The FICA and the Fed Med are just net numbers based on the pluses and minuses of the above, it's small incidental numbers. So in totality, salary increase and fringe benefit increase, the budget shows $7.2 million of increase. I've accounted for $7.1 million in this little short synopsis that I had before you this evening. Next slide. Purchase non-staffing. Other purchase services did the same thing. Mentoring has been is a hot topic. Current year was a budget of 0. We plan on putting in the 102, which is what we had budgeted in the past. School committee adopted a budget of 100. That's an increase of $100,000. But even though there's a $100,000 increase in purchase services, 5 threes, our total category is $40,000 less than the beginning budget for this year, and so I broke out below, which wasn't publicly acknowledged in February, where our cost savings were. Purchase services, other special ed students, we're saving $45,000. PD going from 123 to 52, $70,000. Conferences down $3,000. Legal is a $25,000 increase based on the activities we got in front of us. Health provider, that is the Northeast Strength Training Program and our concussion protocol program that we have at the 2 high schools. We cut that artificially down to $88,000, and it severely, not artificially, but we did cut that this past year, and it dramatically impacted our ability to have concussion protocol folks on the sidelines for every one of our games. And the athletic director, in conversation with the school committee, said we really need to fund this at the full level, and so they're going to 125. That's a $36,000 increase. And other professional services going from $80,000 to $29,000. We cut the accountant consultant that we brought in that worked with us to do a better job of setting up a system between reporting between city finance and the school department. That was a 2-year initiative that got completed, so we cut the 51. Purchase property, 54 category, saved $65,000. And again, that was not articulated in February. Other purchase services, primarily we focused on transportation, $9.4 million. We projected $9.589, $114,000 increase. We need 9.7, it's a $300,000 increase. Our biggest issue is the McKinney-Vento and out-of-district students that we're committed to, and our lack of having control over the out-of-district. We serve, actually we were at the obligation to the state to take advantage of the state program, and they changed the way they bill students that ride on these services. So transportation is 300 Gs going up.
Mr.
Thank you.
President.
Yes, Councilman.
Mr. Ferrucci, on the transportation contractual, that's for the school busing services?
Yes.
Okay.
Of that $7 million for the special ed and the regular ed inside the city of Warwick, in which we manage the actual routes. The balance of that is what we have to pay to the state to put students on buses that the state runs throughout the state of Rhode Island.
And that contract took effect when?
The school committee exercised a 2-year option, which put it out to 2021, June of 2021, which would have made it 2016. Was the first year of this most recent contract.
And you said 7 million something or other, so roughly somewhere around 4% of your budget. And did that contract go out for bid?
Yes.
Or did you just renew it?
No, we sent it out to bid.
So the school bus contract went out for bid?
Yep.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Out-of-district tuitions, I think this goes to Mr. Cawley's question. So again, this year, budget $339,000. We knew it was over $1 million. This is the one that was cut, anticipating a waiver from the state. Our current preliminary budget for next year, 1.5 million. Look to the left of the 1.5, 1,402,000 is what our current tuition for that line is for FY19. That $1.1 million differential is what I'm referring to. That is the lead issue on reinstating anything on the current operations. We've said this time and again that the pecking order of the $4 million year-end projection, any savings, was to attack this particular issue first, 1.1 million of it, because we were having state aid targeted. The next piece was going to be the $500,000 of contingency, and then the third piece was going to be principal and interest of bond and answer that question. And then after that would be whatever would be reinstated, and I think we've all in agreement that the second shift custodians absolutely had to come back, and that's where the sequence of priorities were that the school department's been working under all school year long. So projected increase in tuitions on the $1.4 million is 3%, and we typically budget 5 contingencies. So we create a budget with those that are currently enrolled that are not graduating, and then we add 5. Last year, when we added 5, we ended up with 15 going to North Kingston alone. We were 10 shy. That's what one of the dramatic cost increases were to make it a $1.4 million hit for this particular year. So we projected $1,526,000. My actual number is $589 based on our enrollment, 5 contingencies in there too. That's a $1,250,000 increase on the tuition for next year.
Mr. Corley, did you have a question on that tuition increase? I mean, the 1.5, I think you...
The question I have is the out-of-district tuition. How many students are you budgeting for? How many go out of state, out of district this year?
I do have that in the big budget that I released in April, so just give me a moment to look that up. On page 40, don't need to look it up now, but if the folks are paying attention or have the budget in hand, on page 40 is a schedule of our out-of-district tuition. For $1,589,000 in tuition, there are 98 students budgeted for that. Currently this year, we have 94 students. So I'm only doing a 4-student increase for contingency for next year.
Currently, there's 94 students that are going out of district.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Frucci. Continue.
And now to the last page. Other purchase services continued. This is the charter school tuition, which is a separate line. Our current budget this year was $1.18 million. Our actual for this year was $1.287. I projected a 3% and a 5 contingency for 1.4. The actual that I need for next year is 1.3. So we're $143,000 over budget from current year going into next, but it's slightly below what I projected back in February. The other notable that was not brought public back in February, special ed tuitions, line number 55610 and 55630. Current year budget $5.3 million, next year $5.7. That's a $400,000 increase. Supplies and materials, textbooks, $188,000 is our budget for this year. Preliminary budget for next year was $300,000 because there is a math initiative that's trying to be undertaken. We were projecting a $111,000 increase. The actual budget for next year is $250,000, so it's a $60,000 increase. But the reason why that number went down, it was anticipated that the curriculum that we needed for teachers to be able to start preparing their lessons plans, etc., we were going to buy those materials this year. And so there was expectations to bring requests to the school committee to purchase the materials necessary to get ready And then these materials were actually going to be student materials, because we know whether we paid for it this year or paid for it next year, it was still going to be a budget struggle. And so math is a huge initiative that the district needs to address, and I would defer to the superintendent and our curriculum leadership to talk about the level of priority that is. But this does go to some of the strategic points that were made during previous conversations about what we could have frozen in this year's budget, what that impact would be on for next year. And so the school committee was going to be presented with, here's the priorities. Can we afford to not do it this year and put it in the next year, or is it so high of priority that you do that? So some of the savings that might potentially flow through this year would be consumed by some of these targets that I'm speaking to this evening right now. So it's 63,000. All instructional supplies, 598. We got a budget of 761. This is an iReady program that the curriculum folks have targeted specifically. That's it. We're level funding all supplies throughout the district, other than that one initiative, 163,000. And our electricity, we budgeted 1.4 million this year. We're projecting 1.3 million for next year, and that has to do with the energy efficiency equipment that we've been installing, and we're looking at saving $120,000 having the equipment in for the whole year. We finished up those projects in late fall this year, so we've got a half-year savings coming in. So we're really looking forward to the energy reduction costs projected for next year based on that. Last big items, capital improvements. Current budget is $822,000. At the time, we were under the understanding that we needed to make a 1.5% set aside to meet the housing aid requirements out of the operating budget. And so I showed the school committee a $2.5 million need based on a $169 million budget. Maintenance staff, we were targeting what they do as part of meeting that obligation for $775, and other supplies to support them of $220, and that we would need $1.5 million in our 57202. So I projected $1.540 million. I projected $1.540 million and a $700,000 increase. We've since learned that that the bond projects can't qualify us for the 1.5% obligation. However, I can't stress this enough over and over. Our reports, whether it was SMMA or Jacobs from the state, all said that our buildings needed somewhere in the neighborhood of $180 to $200 million worth of work over the next 4 to 5 years to bring them up to a level that's comparable for what those expectations are. We came before this council. We asked for 85 million, we got 40 million, we said it's going to be a phase 1, phase 2. At 40 million, we're talking 20% of the need. There's 80% more need in the district, we get it. We're trying to work with you folks on chipping away at the highest priorities. So there's a portion that's in the bond. That has been in script for 2 years. That's pretty locked in, both at the voter level and at the RIDE level. We do have approval for capital reserve, which I refer to our 57202 at the state level as capital reserve. So if we could pay for a project that's approved by RIDE on a capital reserve projects, we will get state aid reimbursement back for those projects. The money that's targeted are things that have been approved by RIDE already as capital reserve, and those projects that just have come to light over the last 6 months to a year because they're not in any of the preceding plans. As an example, within this number right now, we have a real huge problem at Windman Middle School. We've got heating units that went bad on us in February. We're staring at an obligation of about $500,000. It's not in the bond. Windman Middle School's heating system were the newer heating systems compared to all the other heating systems in the state. It didn't get on anybody's radar. They're new, but they're in 1970s models new versus buildings that are built in the 50s and 60s. So the priority pecking order put them so far below what had to be done. However, it now has died, and we got to do something. So the money was put into this budget. I just read this evening that there is a capital budget that was prepared by the mayor for your consideration. My past history, my first 7 years here, school department would turn in capital projects. I truly believe that the capital project of $500,000 in our operating budget for the school doesn't make sense. It should be part of your capital program. And the reason why I find that important is if you funded the funds through the operating budget, it now becomes part of your MOE. If it's just funded through the capital projects, you're not obligated to give the school department the project money for the following year. So that if you have a level-funded baseline capital program, the leadership of this community can make the decision as to what's the highest priorities and mix and match on an annual basis. So if we are notified that portions of the capital projects budget include school department, then some of those projects will be taken out of this operating budget. So I just saw that this evening, but just know that that's one area that we could actually go after if we've got funding from some of those projects that are noted in your capital budget. I'm not sure where that's on your agenda, but in future consideration, that would be the first thing we would reduce if we got notice that the capital budget portion of the school department is being funded. We would immediately go into this budget, make those cuts, and be able to get back to you to let you know what the impact is. But for folks who have it, in the 45-page document released in April, there is Appendix B. You can go right down Appendix B, you will know what's in there. So that way there, when you say we're going to fund this piece, I will pull Appendix B. It's not like I'm going to say, oh, that wasn't in, and we're going to put it in now, or what have you. You have Appendix B. That is our Bible, and we can then just make those cuts without impacting the schools. And I think it's a great opportunity, and I want to thank the mayor for including the school department, because like I said, in the past 7 years, school department's capital budget, I was never aware of anything being brought forward before the school committee, the city council, for consideration on behalf of the schools.
Mr. Frucci, with regard to the bond, this council had approved $40 million. It went out to the electorate to vote on last fall, which was approved. You had mentioned that you're looking for 85. And I just didn't want to give everyone the impression that the council doesn't recognize the need for infrastructure improvements also. When it was approved, the bond, it came back before us this year, and we released to the school committee $6 million for infrastructure improvement, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I just didn't hear that as part of your presentation. And what's important here is that as we release bonds, as your testimony was when you came before us asking us to put that in there, bonds can only be released so much every year. For financial reasons, if you release it all at once, you won't be able to pay the principal and interest. So as part of a strategy, you release principal and interest as you retire debt and interest. And so you acknowledged that even if we had given you $85 million, you wouldn't be able to reach it maybe till 5 or 6 years down the road because of how we release debt over time. And so, as I recall the testimony when it came in about bonding, was that we would consider for the fall of 2020, a bond referendum. And my experience on the council has been that projects change over time, needs change. You're mentioning Windman. You didn't know a boiler was going to fail. I recall Mayor Avedisian froze your bond money for 6 or 7 years. That no one anticipated. But as the needs of the community changed after the Station nightclub fire, there were certain issues that you didn't know would be thrust upon you by state law, including changes for fire code regulations, et cetera. So the only reason that I bring that up is because, and again, I speak for myself in reiterating what the testimony was, but we gave 40 million knowing that we could consider more in the future, and it would give this council more control over what we're hearing and what we're listening to and more input. If we had approved an $85 million bond and there were changes in the future, we may or may not have had the dialogue on that the council would like. So this gives us another opportunity to listen to your presentations, to see how you've progressed, to see the infrastructure improvements that you've made, and also to identify changes such as you mentioned with Windman that people might have known about. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Council President. The only comment to follow up on that, and I think it's a great segue, the building committee is meeting monthly, if not twice a month. On our target is a mid-June meeting. During that meeting, we are opening up the next second phase request. We are going over the prioritization, but more importantly, we're also revisiting the budgets, because the budgets that were created for these projects now goes back close to 4.5 years, back before there was a lot of work in the state. And we're all starting to see there's so much work in the state that pricing is not as aggressive as it used to be. Actually, it's the flip side. If I don't get it here, I'm going to get it someplace else. So we actually have had to not award a contract and re-engineer and redesign to try and get the projects down to the budget numbers that we've got on our target now. Not your issues. My point is we are wrestling with that. Our target is to be in front of the school committee by the tail end of July, because we need to send a letter of intent to the Rhode Island Department of Ed by August 1st if we want to get on the referendum for November 2020. That's preliminary. There's no cost associated with it. I think we're going to move that forward. We will then move to a stage 1 with RIDE, which is due October 1st. And then we'll be coming back before the council targeting around Christmas or the first of the year like we've done before, seeking your support on that next phase. That has to be in place for February 1, 2020. RIDE would then move that along under their consideration for housing aid, and then we'd be seeking state support for the referendum and then be teed up for November. So you'll hear more about it is my point. But the school committee is going to have to struggle with, it cost us close to $200,000 last time for a consultant to get us through the stage 1 and stage 2. I don't know where we're going to find the funds. It's a challenge in front of us, but there'll be some more dialogue coming up on it. To your point, we need to validate those priorities and the budget figures before we can have any further conversations. And so,
And there are also state matching funds involved. Could you explain how much? Percentage-wise?
well, they're still working under the current allocations of Warwick being in the area of 40% and then having a 5% energy and a 5%, I believe there's 2 targets of credits. So we're still in the 40% basket. The question is how it's going to be paid, whether they call it pay-as-you-go, which allows us to go borrow less, but you get no housing aid on it because they're going to give it to you up front, or they're going to commit housing aid based on your bond schedules and those kinds of things. So the round target is still 40%, and then make the projects qualify for the credits, and we go after those extra 10%, those 10 percentage points.
So it could be up to 50.
That's correct.
So for every dollar we spend, we could get 50% from the state.
That's
Could.
correct. That is our target, yes.
Thank you.
To kind of wrap up the form we have in front of you, we have in the current budget $948,000. Again, $500,000 of that is the Windman project, so if the capital program gets approved, that would be the first thing off, and we can go from there. Things that weren't identified in February, vehicles. We've got a need of at least 6 vehicles in our buildings and grounds. We're concerned they're not going to pass inspection, at least 4 of them. We know we could not afford to make that presentation. The only thing that's moved forward is 2 vehicles. So we got 2 vehicles for $100,000. Equipment, $186,000 what we're currently budgeted. 183 is a slight cut. Furniture and fixtures, 170 down to 52. That differential was all of our consolidation and reprogramming that took place when we created the new program at John Brown Francis and those kinds of things, and moving the sixth graders up into the middle school environments and creating middle school classrooms as opposed to what they were accustomed to in the sixth grade. All of that work is done, so there's been the savings there. And then the hardware, for tech hardware and software, our current budget is $1.8 million, and in totality it's $1.6 million. Again, in the 50-page budget document, there's an Appendix A, and it literally breaks down what software for $3,700. That's all part of the package for folks who want to understand that. Our debt service, the school department had a zero budget for principal and interest for 2019. That's how they balanced their budget. And they're sustaining that going into 2020. So there's a small $200 savings in total category. And lastly, fund transfers. That used to be a contribution into the school lunch program, because that's where the building aides used to get paid from, was out of the school lunch, under the auspice of recess and cafeteria duty. But it's still operating budget. So by having the staff now be part of our operating budget on the 5110 line, so we can count the staff and everybody would know how many people we're talking about, we're reducing that contribution. It's not going to be required going forward. So that offsets some of that cost on that pilot program I spoke at the beginning. To sum it all up, the grade bod areas, I did notice there was one tally that I'll explain. When I first presented this, we had salary only and then everything else, which was fringe benefit and everything else. That tally for everything else, including fringe benefit, was $6.5 million. When I ran the report to show where we stand today, I did salary and fringe benefit as one number and then everything else. So you'll see under the comparison piece, the things that I've accounted for as increases is $2.2 million is attributed to all non-staff expenses, not including fringe benefits. The column to the right is the $1.6 million because there's pluses and minuses that make it all work out. I recalculated, so non-staff fringe benefits and staff costs, separate. That $6.5 million should read $2,455,000. That'll give you the trend line of comparables of 2.5 is where I thought we were going to be. I tallied up 2.2, but the actual cost increase is $1.6 million. So you got all that data in front of you. So the $1.6 million in cost increases non-staff, plus the staff cost increases salary and fringe benefits of $7.2 million gets us to an expenditure increase of 8.879, expenditure side of the budget. As I mentioned at the beginning, the state did change its contribution rate, its share, and we did get an increase in state aid, and that state aid was about $1 million on our budget side of things. So the net cost is the $7.7 million that the school committee is seeking from the city in local support. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I think since we've all been through the detail so often, that just using this as our target impact will make the conversation easier, but I'm happy to answer any questions on the depth of information because I do have the other budgets with me this evening. Thank you.
Mr. Frucci, you had, or we had received a amendment, the council did. Could you explain how that amendment was calculated, why it was calculated, and what it refers to?
Sure. Again, the amendment was recognizing the actuarial report that was received by the school department in October of 2018, where it indicated that a contribution to the pension program, recommended contributions, a minimum of $1 million, and an alternate if we wanted to make contributions against the unfunded balance that they still were reporting of $1.2 million. And that versus the $1.8 million that was budgeted and paid for this school year, the school committee had the question of If they roll back to these numbers, if the actuary report, and there is an email that's attached from our actuary indicating that the change in ASOP 35, which is the Actuarial Standard Operating Procedures that was promulgated and released in January 2019, could see, because it's changing the mortality tables that they're going to be required to use, could see us having an actuarial report come out in October saying next school year you should be contributing $1.9 million. So with those two pieces of information in their hands, they took the position of, well, even if it comes in at $1.9 million next year, since we contributed $1.8 million this year and $1 million next year, over a 2-year, it should work out. But then we will be faced with, what are you going to do for 2021? Because if you're at $1 million this year, you could see a significant hike in the following year, but at least there's some rational basis between averaging over 2 years versus what's taken place. It will be interesting to see, because my experience on the investment committee has been, even in years when we over-contributed according to the minimum requirements, not even, I call it recommendations, they're not requirements, our unfunded balance still went up. So that their calculations showed that either people earned a higher level of benefit, people didn't contribute at the same level, or the investments did not achieve the returns that they originally were targeting. And so I know and understand and appreciate everyone's trying to understand this complicated process. But I'm happy that we're having this conversation rather than the other one. And the other one is this: you buy low and you sell high. When the market was going down and we made those purchases of assets, it contributed to the success of where we are today. If we were at the minimum 5 years ago and didn't buy low and were in a position to sell high, I think we would see that our reports for this year could have been in excess of $1.8 million already. So I understand what we're struggling with, but I'd rather be on this side of the fence saying we've got the money in the bank for our retirees and we can afford to potentially take a reduction this year because you got it, versus where we might have been if we hadn't done what we did. So I can go home and sleep at night based on that premise. And I'm backed up by, state leadership. Our target was 100% funded. I know 92 as well. I also take pride in the fact that the Treasurer's Office highlighted us in the newspaper as one of the top 4 performing. Warwick needs to take accolades for what it does well. You can't lose sight of that, even when we have budget struggles like we had before us this evening.
So, Mr. Frucci, many of us have mortgages, and we all like to prepay our mortgage, but not if we can't pay the electric bill, okay? And when this council is getting calls from kids, from parents, from staff, as you said today, $380,000 to restore washing bathrooms every day and throwing out the trash. When custodians are losing jobs and getting cut, when you have $102,000 that you're restoring for the mentor program. How many of us got calls and emails on the mentor program? That's $482,000, and you were overpaying last year by $800,000. And this council and administration had to get calls that we were not funding education properly. It leaves a bitter taste in this council member's mouth, okay? That we're not funding education because we're prepaying things while kids are getting sick and getting strep throat and all these other things. We need, and I appreciate what this new school committee did in reducing the amount of the contribution to what is actually recommended by the actuaries, so that you can restore. What's the most important thing is the health, education, and safety of our kids and our staff and our parents. To make sure that bathrooms are getting washed and that mentors are in classrooms. And I appreciate the work of the new school committee. But last year, when I sat in those meetings and I didn't have the benefit of Markham's presentation that they gave tonight at the beginning of this, I was at a loss. Right now, I believe we pay because of, and you talk about contributions to the school department, our population has gone from, 12,000 to about 8,000 kids. We've closed schools. We laid off staff. We've gone down in the amount of education that we need to provide as far as financing and monetary contributions. But the cost of that education has gone up. It's about $19,200 per pupil right now, whereas I think Cranston is around $15,000 per pupil. And we can certainly, and I'm sure we will, have arguments about how we're going to distinguish Cranston from Warwick, etc. But it gives us a barometer of what's fair and what isn't. And what was a tough year because the previous administration left, and the fact that we did the best that we could budgeting, turned out to be a frustrating year for this council person, because when you see that we had the money for these programs and the new school committee put that money back in, you know, that part's refreshing. The rest of what Markham had talked about tonight, I don't know if you're planning on addressing line items that they identified with regard to housing, unreported revenue for housing, and all the rest of the line items that added up to what they were anticipating, $3.5 million for this year. And that's based on those estimates. Thank you. Councilman Lattiser.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Ferrucci, I find it particularly concerning that how we found out about this overfunding, voluntarily, willfully overfunding the pensions, was in an arbitration meeting with you and your colleagues. And it's pretty concerning to me to hear the conversation again say that, yeah, we're really pleased that we've overfunded, we funded 92%, with projections, by the way, which we didn't mention, of potentially up to 104% this year. And in the beginning of your conversation, you said that we want to do what's right for the students. I don't understand how that statement correlates to knowingly overfunding a pension when there are actuaries out there that get paid to advise you what you need to put in your pension, what the minimum is, what the maximum is. And here's how I see it. How I see it is that these pensions were overfunded with taxpayer dollars. It's taxpayer dollars that overfunded that pension at the expense of the students. You did not need to put an additional $4 million beyond what professional actuaries advised you of doing. But you did. And then the school department, year after year after year, comes before this council and says, it's your fault. You said it tonight. We have a contingency plan. If we don't do that contingency, we're going to have to cut sports or consider cutting sports. And I've been sitting here now, this is my 7th budget hearing, listening to these same comments. So, in the end, I view it this way. What the school department did, the administration, you intentionally overfunded beyond the high number of the actuaries instead of cleaning the schools, instead of having the mentor program in place, instead of. And it wasn't necessary. We wouldn't be having this conversation now if it were the opposite, because you can't give what you don't have. But you shouldn't take what you can give. Instead, we end up with custodians laid off. Myself and a couple of my other colleagues attended a meeting at one of the schools, and we listened to teachers, and we listened to members of the different departments discussing the disgusting situations that exist in at least this one particular school. And then in the end, I have to learn in an arbitration meeting that, oh, by the way, we could have funded the mentor program for $100,000. We could have paid custodians to clean these schools. We could have did this, we could have did that, but instead we chose to overfund the pension $4 million. So, obviously, you view it from one perspective, and I certainly view it from a different perspective, and I don't consider that a good business practice to overfund your savings account at the expense of the kids, of the teachers, of the schools. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. Frucci, just to follow up on one question here, what was your adopted amended budget for 2018-2019?
Current year?
Yeah, current year.
I didn't have an amended budget adoption for current year.
Okay, so what was your budget for 2018-2019?
The original budget for 2018, $164,774,146. That was approximately $1.9 million less than what we finished last year. Last year we finished at $166,624,000. So it was a $2 million reduction from where we finished.
As I recall, you adopted a budget with line item expenditures, correct?
Yep.
That total 164.
Yes.
How much did you overspend your budget this year?
Well, we've sustained so that folks would not get confused about the principal and interest. In the 164 budget that was adopted by the school committee, okay, the principal and interest is zero. So there was no intent of paying principal and interest this year on the 164 adopted budget. We were adding that so we didn't lose sight of those numbers. So from that perspective, we're a little over $2.3 million short on everything else other than the principal and interest issue.
And if you add in principal and interest?
$4 million.
So you overspent your budget by $4 million, correct?
That's what it's projecting out to be, that's correct.
And by state law, you cannot overspend your budget, correct?
Yep.
Go ahead, Councilman Corley.
Mr. Ferrucci, as the figures I have show that this year the cost per student is about $19,300, and under your proposed budget, it's $19,700. I imagine that is at the top of spending for the state of Rhode Island for cities and towns. Is that correct?
I don't know the ranking offhand, but it sounds reasonable, yes.
And I know I did some quick math concerning the out-of-district tuition this year. The kids that went out of district cost the taxpayers from Warwick $14,900, and next year will be approximately $16,200. So I guess an argument could be made to the taxpayers that it costs less in taxes for the kids in Warwick to be educated out of district. And the performance of what I read concerning the Warwick students certainly is not #1 in the state scholastically. And there's probably a whole lot of reasons for that, but it is not something that I have had the opportunity to really get into when people call me and ask me about the tax cost versus the education performance. Can you give me something to explain to a taxpayer that calls why we have either the most expensive per student rate or pretty close to it, and we have our students rated scholastically on the test scores where they are?
I'd have to defer on the curriculum side of things for your point with regards to performance. All I can refer to is the performance audit that took place this past year. As you're aware, Mr. Hicks came in, a former superintendent, and had done a program analysis about what may have been cut that was BEP and it needed to come back in, so that was points of interest. But we also had a gentleman who came in assisting Mr. Hicks on one end, and then took on another project that was communicated, and I know that's been circulated because it was released from my office. And what that was an analysis of taking our current staffing pattern for 2019, actual people with their step level and all the other things that they have available, and repriced it using Cranston's labor contracts. All. So whatever they had for policy, procedures, for administration and non-unionized staff, plus the unionized staff. And that calculation came back between salary and fringe benefits, approximately $9 million more in Warwick than in Cranston. Not Social Security, in totality salary and associated fringe with that salary. So that information has been out. I believe it's going to be something you'll hear more and more about as we proceed. I know that's our labor front on the backside, transportation-wise, with the airport smack dab in the center of the city. We end up having to transport that's different than most communities, and so that impacts some of our transportation costs. And then lastly, this community really wanted to have small schools still in neighborhoods. And you know clearly, Mr. Crowley, the issues we had with dealing with JBF being turned into a preschool as opposed to staying at an elementary school. So there is some price to pay to have many smaller elementary schools scattered throughout. The former school committee, and I believe this school committee is picking up the gauntlet, that we are now right-sized with the numbers of schools in all the various communities that they serve. So I think all of those combinations of factors play into the question that you just presented me.
I understand the using of Cranston for its proximity concerning the pricing, but I would be interested to find out, because it would seem to me that parents are sending their kids, students, to out-of-district schools that are outperforming Warwick rather than underperforming Warwick scholastically, and it is costing the taxpayer anywhere from $44,000 to $5,000 less per year.
If I could, in terms of that question, Councilman Corley, I have been working with Rep. Shanley at the State House to actually look at changing the law in terms of how students can matriculate to other districts. Right now, as the law reads, if we have a career and tech program, let's say in auto in Warwick, a student can still choose to go to the auto program in Coventry. They can go where they want to go. And to my experience, it really is about zip codes in many cases. In many cases, they're not outperforming. They could be equally performing, some higher, some lower. The rep's language change, which I think has traction, would say if we have the same program as a different district, the student would stay with us. So I think in some cases, you're seeing people leave for different reasons. We have some kids going to a music pathway in the northern part of the state. We have the same music programs here in Warwick. We have some folks going to programs in auto, like I said, in carpentry. So I'm hoping this session at the State House, they will look to change the law and make it so if we have the same program, they wouldn't leave. Because right now, I can tell you, I'm signing these forms on a daily basis across Rhode Island. It really is school choice in Rhode Island